Yo, Chiefs fans, what's up? Gary McKenzie back at you again for another episode of Gridiron Lines. And in today's episode, I'm going to continue working through some of this data we've gotten created. Tons and tons of data to go through, and I want to talk about how it impacts Skyy Moore and Rashee Rice as far as what Skyy Moore did last year and what Rashee Rice might do next year. This is not the official prediction video yet, but there's so much content, so much data to go through here, so many interesting things that I've queried. Sit tight because this is going to be awesome. And if you're looking at your screen here, real quick, just going through all of the data that I've created. So I know I've mentioned this several times, but it took me several weeks to accumulate all this data, and it's essentially just all of the past 10 years worth of data for wide receivers coming out of college. So I have their college statistics and then their first 3 years of statistics in the NFL. So from 2013 to 2023, I have all that information, all of that data. So it's tons and tons of data points. I had to manually enter all of these fields. And if you've been hanging out with me the past several weeks, you would have noticed that. But also, speaking of hanging out with me for the last several weeks, I just wanted to throw a shout out to everyone that commented on last week's video. I mean, it's really you all, the viewers, who I'm doing this for. This isn't about me. I'm doing this to provide content out in the Chiefs atmosphere, the Chiefs stratosphere. And I do it because I want to give back to so many Chiefs fans who are just genuinely great people and share that common love for the Chiefs like I do. And so, I've had a lot of people that have been just rolling with me since day one. And one of them has been Ryan White. Ryan, I really appreciate you. William, I appreciate you too. You've commented several times on my videos. And Mikal or Micah L, I don't know which one that is. You had some really positive things to say about my video last week, and really that makes my job much easier because sometimes, as a content creator, things can get difficult, or you may doubt yourself, or you may, wonder, am I doing good enough? And so sometimes it's really nice to have that positive feedback. And I'm not saying it's not nice to also have constructive criticism, because that's what I use to get better. And so I just want to say I really appreciate everyone who took the time to comment on last week's video. Y'all are great, and I do this for you. It's a labor of love, and I'm just really grateful to be able to share this community and be a part of this community with Ryan and Dan and Seth that has this platform. So I just want to say thank you, and if you want to thank me back, make sure you go ahead and, like this video and subscribe if you haven't done so already. I know that the group at RGR Football really appreciate it, but that's all I've got to say about, just my feelings towards that front. I just really want to say thank you. So thank you, everyone, for what you've done. Now, back to our data. We've got tons of data here, and I was able to start to compile it, and I'm not as far as I want to be at this point in time, but I think it's just my nature. I always want to do more. I'm a more person. My son has this funny saying where he says, what the problem with too much is? It's never enough. And that's kind of how I feel. So it's just a little personality quirk that I need to work on. But let's look at some of the aggregates that I've generated here. And I'm still working through all of the rounds. I've got a ton of formulas going on here. This data is crazy. I'm pretty wild with Google Sheets or spreadsheets in general. And one of the first things that I wanted to look up was how productive were college wide receivers in their first year in the NFL. So how productive was that transition between college to the professional level? At what rate did their college production carry over into the NFL? So in terms of all wide receivers taken in the NFL draft, they averaged roughly 60 yards per game receiving. They averaged roughly half a touchdown per game. They averaged roughly 4 receptions per game in college. So that's their college averages. All wide receivers in the past 10 years. About 60 receiving yards per game, a half a touchdown per game, and then 4 receptions per game in college. what did the average wide receiver in the last 10 years do in the NFL? So in their first season, they averaged about 20 receiving yards, uh, 0.13 receiving touchdowns per game, and 1.6 receptions per game. That's in their first year. I haven't gotten to their second year or their third year, but on average, NFL wide receivers taken in the draft have a 60% reduction in their receiving yards, a 74% reduction in their receiving touchdowns, and a 60% reduction in their receptions, their total receptions. So these statistics that they had in college are consistently dropping, and it's pretty consistent across the board. So I broke that down round by round. And so what can we say about that? So in year one, as we mentioned, the average reduction in receiving yards, touchdowns, and receptions is 60%, 74%, and 60%. So stark drop in terms of productivity going from their average in college to the wide receiver average in the NFL. How does that break down round by round, though? So you would think intuitively that the higher the players picked, the more production they'll have in the NFL, because NFL GMs, I like to bash them all the time, but they're actually not too bad at predicting players. They could be a lot worse. But there's also two things to this that I want to mention. And it's kind of a chicken or the egg discussion. So do first-round wide receivers average higher production or have higher production because they're better players, they're more talented? Or do they average more yards because of the investment that was spent? So, for example, a lot of capital is spent on a player. Say they trade up a few spots in the first round to get a wide receiver that they like. And a lot of coaches have a problem with their ego or wanting to look good or trying to force their appearance, where they will force feed that wide receiver because of that decision. So my question is that I'm asking and kind of floating out there is, were these first round wide receivers having good production because they were more talented, they were better players, or was part of that because they were selected in the first round and coaches feel the need to justify that selection? This is just a personal opinion of mine. I haven't crunched the numbers on this. In fact, this is something that's impossible to crunch numbers for. But I think it's a tiny bit of both. I lean towards more of it being due to the fact that they're talented. Obviously, first-round players picked in the draft, that's a pretty dang good player. But also, I think there's several coaches out there who want to see their guys, put out good production and not be a liability, not look like they made a bad pick. And, I think that there's a little bit of data to back this up, because while I was crunching through all the numbers, I saw something that was, that happened over and over again. A player's taken in the first, second, third, fourth round. A wide receiver's taken in one of those rounds. The first year they have their best production. The next year they have a little less production. And the year after that, they're pretty much almost out of the NFL. And so that tells me that as teams change head coaches, as teams, grow over time, these wide receivers that were doing really well their first year, they kind of fell off the map. And I think that can be explained by coaches having their guys that they want to succeed. And then a new coach comes in and they're like, this guy's terrible. We don't want to force feed him anymore like the old coach was doing. So we're just going to kind of let things happen the way they happen in the NFL and see you later. There's tons of wide receivers like this where this happens too. And I want to say this is one of the things I really appreciate about Andy Reid, because he doesn't get caught up in what round was this player drafted, how much capital have we spent on this player, what's their salary cap hit. I don't think he cares. I truly think Andy Reid is interested in playing the best player. And that's that. It doesn't matter what round he's drafted in. He's going to fit them in the offense the way he best sees it. and he doesn't concern himself with all of the other noise. And I think that's partly one of the reasons why he's been so successful. And so other teams, you can see this happening a lot where, while the coach is still attached to that player, their production's up. And then as the coach becomes detached over time or a new head coach comes in, then that player's production drops and eventually they're out of the NFL. So that's my little spiel on that. But I want to talk about round one wide receivers compared to the average wide receiver. So, do round one wide receivers produce better in terms of how their college statistics translate to the NFL? And I will say yes, that is the case. In fact, there's a pretty steady decrease from rounds 1 through 7. So in round one, wide receivers average a 40% drop in terms of their receiving yards, a 59% drop in terms of their touchdowns, and a 30% drop in terms of their receptions. So this 30% drop in terms of the reception is the smallest drop of any draft, of any statistic, of any draft round, of any statistic. So it tells me that maybe there's a little bit of force feeding going on for those first round wide receivers. But at the same time, like I said, they're talented players. They're taken first in the first round for a reason. And so what this means is that the NFL GMs are doing a pretty good job drafting their players. They have the smallest reduction in the first round. Then you have the second round, and there's a 50% drop in receiving yards, 60% drop in touchdowns, a 41% drop in receptions. So looking at this data, where you want to draft a wide receiver is in the first or second round. I say that because once you get past the second round, there's a huge drop. There's a bit of a cliff. And so, first, second round wide receivers, 40, 50% reduction in receiving yards. The average reduction of an NFL player is 60%. In terms of the touchdowns, first and second round wide receivers, about the same, 60% reduction. The average is a 74% reduction, so they're up 14 points there. And then the the receptions, first round 30% reduction, second round 41% reduction. The NFL average is a 60% reduction. So you're still above the average, player transitioning from the college to the NFL in terms of how their production translates into the NFL. And so the cliff happens that are in between round 2 and 3. And this is data from the last 10 years. Once you get into round 3, then your averages really drop, and they drop below what the average of the rest of the NFL draft is for the wide receivers. So if you want to get a wide receiver, you want to do it in the first or second rounds, unless you're, taking a flyer on a guy. And NFL teams love taking flyers on wide receivers in the 6th round. While I was calculating this data, no other round had more wide receivers taking it, and it wasn't even close. So 6th round is kind of like that, I guess, where NFL teams say, hey, we're going to take a shot on this wide receiver. Let's see what happens. But as you can see through the other rounds, 1 through 7, there's a consistent drop in productivity in terms of how it translates between the NFL, between the college statistics and the NFL statistics for these wide receivers. And I'll say that I was a little bit surprised by the late rounds, how much of a drop it was, because I figured, in the later rounds, they're taking less productive guys because all the more productive guys are taken in the earlier rounds. We talked about that in our last video where NFL GMs do care about college production. The higher your production, the more likely you are to be taken in the first round. So I thought as these players had less production in college, it'd be easier to boost that in the NFL because you'd need to have fewer yards and fewer touchdowns and fewer receptions. But that's not the case. Consistent drop across the board. There's a small uptick in round 5 between round 4 and 5. I don't know why that is. It could be anything. Could be some outliers. Could be Tyreek Hill for all I know. But I thought that was interesting. So, looking at all this data and looking at the average production drop, I mean, players are dropping 40% of their production, 50%, 60%, 70% of their production going from college to the NFL. And this is based on per game statistics. So if you averaged 100 yards per game receiving in college, then the average reduction of that, if you were taken in the first round, would put you down to about 60 yards per game in the NFL. which is, I think you'd be a 1,000-yard receiver if you did that, which is pretty impressive. But you can see, like, there's there's this stark reduction between college stats and NFL stats. So the next question you might ask yourself is, well, what percentage of these players in the draft that were drafted at the wide receiver position in the last 10 years, what percentage of them actually outperformed their college statistics? So who played better in the NFL than they did in college? And these are the players that NFL GMs are really searching for, these diamonds in the rough. And I broke it down by round. And like I said before, I've only been able to do year one. So in their first season in the NFL, same as the last data we went through, the first season, only 12% of first round players had more receiving yards per game than they did in college. 7% of first rounders had more touchdowns than they averaged in college. And a surprising 21% of receivers had more receptions than they averaged in college. In terms of all the total of players in their first year in the NFL, going from college to the NFL, only 6% of players that were drafted in their first year had more receiving yards per game than they did in college. Only 5% had more touchdowns per game than they did in college. Only 9% had more receiving yards per game than they did in college. The second round is kind of the sweet spot for finding these diamonds in the rough, or I wouldn't really say diamonds in the rough, but for finding these overproducers going from the college game to the NFL game. So 26%, 1 in 4 of second round wide receivers taken in their first year following the draft, in their first year as a rookie in the NFL, 26% of them had more receiving yards per game than they did in college. That's a meaningful statistic. In fact, that's the highest outlier of all this little window of statistics here. So what does that tell me? That tells me that a lot of second round guys might be some guys who are more talented and, didn't have the production. Maybe they weren't in the right team. They weren't the right fit in college. They get to the NFL and then, whoa, this guy's pretty dang good. We can use him. We can win with this guy. So I think that's kind of where the second round wide receivers are drafted. They're the guys that maybe weren't taken in the first round because they didn't have both the explosive athleticism and the explosive production. Maybe they just had the athleticism and a little less production, but still enough to have a meaningful impact in college. So I think that's kind of where that may be coming from. 12% of second round wide receivers taken in the draft had more touchdowns per game than they averaged in college when they were a rookie in the NFL. And then 28% of second round wide receivers had more receptions in their rookie year in the NFL than they did throughout their college career. So once again, I'm going to say that the first and second round is still the sweet spot to draft NFL wide receivers. If you want a guy that's going to produce and, have the best shot of making an impact in the NFL, first and second round, with the second round kind of being the sweet spot. And the Chiefs have had 2 second round wide receivers taken in the last 2 drafts. Skyy Moore and Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice, as you all know, is my draft crush. And we're going to talk about him in a little bit. But looking at these, percentage of players that actually outperform their college numbers, you have this, general kind of reduction, some random noise here. But essentially, once you get past round 3, the likelihood of one of these players outperforming what they did in college is extremely low. And so that's why I'm saying that the first 2 rounds are the sweet spot, and the Chiefs have been really hitting that sweet spot with the second round. And so now let's go and look at some interesting things for Skyy Moore and Rashee Rice. So as you know, Skyy Moore was selected in last year's draft in 2022. He was taken in the second round, 54 overall. In college, he averaged 82.7 yards per game, which is pretty dang good. He averaged 0.53 touchdowns per game and 5.7 receptions per game. When he came into the NFL, he played 16 games last year, and he only averaged 15.6 yards per game, receiving yards per game. Didn't have a single touchdown. As you remember, his first touchdown was in the Super Bowl, so he's kind of legendary for doing that. I like that about Skyy Moore. And then in terms of receptions, he only had 1.38 receptions per game, whenever he had 5.7 receptions per game in college. So his drops in terms of his productivity, he had an 81% drop in terms of receiving yards per game going from college to the NFL. A 100% drop in touchdowns because he didn't have a single touchdown. And then a 76% drop in receptions per game. And so this is Skyy Moore. Skyy Moore had 250 touchdowns with 22 receptions and no touchdowns last year. And, the average college player making that transition in the second round, I think it was a 50% drop. Let me make sure I've got my rounds right here. 40, 59, 30. Let's update these. I can worry about those double percentages at a later time. So the average drop for a second-round wide receiver in terms of their receiving yards was 40% going from college to the NFL. Skyy Moore's drop was 81%. The average drop for receptions was 30%. Skyy Moore was at 76%. So he underproduced last year, which tells me that I think because of this, he has a good shot of rebounding. One is because Juju Smith-Schuster is not going to be on the team next year, and there's kind of an opening for him to really cobble up some yards. And so Skyy Moore, I would describe his rookie season as a mixed bag. You may want to lean towards saying it was disappointing regarding his production, but he also played in the Super Bowl. He filled the role on the team. He overcame some adversity, with the punt return issues that he had early on in the year. So I think that last year was an underperforming year for Skyy Moore. And kind of just looking at the numbers, I think that, law of averages would suggest that maybe he takes a step forward next year and he could get, 500, 600 yards. I'm not putting Skyy Moore. This is not Skyy Moore's projection or my prediction. I'm saving that for a later video. I'll predict, Skyy Moore, Rashee Rice, pretty much any wide receiver they have that hasn't been around for more than 3 seasons, I'll be able to predict. So Skyy Moore underperformed last year. I think we all kind of knew that, but it was a mixed bag of a season. You score a touchdown in the Super Bowl. That's a winner in my book. So mixed bag for Skyy Moore. Moving on to Rashee Rice. So Rashee Rice was taken in the second round once again. Chiefs love that sweet spot second round here in the last couple of years. They've really been focusing on drafting wide receivers who have more production. So Skyy Moore and Rashee Rice both fit that mold. And Rashee Rice, averaged 74 yards per game in college receiving, 0.6 touchdowns per game, and 5.6 receptions per game, all in college. If Rashee Rice had the traditional or the standard reduction in production moving from college to the NFL for a second-round wide receiver, his numbers would look something like this. So this equals F7 times 0.6, 0.3, and then equals H7 times 0.7. Thank you for bearing with me while I did some math. Let's get these numbers nice and formatted really quick. I love spreadsheets, so I'm assuming many of the people that watch this channel also love spreadsheets, so we can all kind of dork out with this together. But if Skyy Moore had the traditional 40% drop in production that most second-round wide receivers have seen, his average yards per game in this rookie year in the NFL would be 44.4. His average touchdowns per game would be 0.3. And his receptions point game would be about 3.8, 3.9. Taking those over the course of a 17-game season, that means that Rashee Rice would have 756 receiving yards, 5 touchdowns, and 66 receptions. This is not my official prediction. This is just kind of a teaser to show you, this is some things we could do. This would be what to expect if Skyy Moore acted and had the production of an average second-round wide receiver taken in the draft in the last 10 years. What his production would translate to in the NFL. So this is just kind of a soft prediction, let's call it that. So we've covered so many bases in this video, I can't even, keep my thoughts straight. But a couple takeaways that I want to have is just like how hard it is to produce in the NFL and be consistent with what you did in college. Very rarely does that happen. And we covered that, just a few minutes ago. So that is why I believe production is so important in terms of selecting college wide receivers in the NFL draft, because it's hard to overproduce what you did in college. It's much more likely that you have a fraction, you produce a fraction of what you did in college, because the competition has been up, the game is harder. And so I'm really impressed with Brett Veach's drafts these last 2 years. I think Skyy Moore has a rebound, and I think Rashee Rice, has a good season next year. I haven't given his official prediction yet, but we're inching towards that. So I hope you've enjoyed the content of this video. Once again, I just want to thank everyone that had positive things to say, and I want to thank all the people that have had constructive criticism for me. I truly appreciate all of you. You really make this worth doing. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. And with that, this is Gary signing out. I've got nothing more to add. Let me know in the comments what you think. Who do you think is or do you think Skyy Moore is gonna have a rebound year next season, or do you think he's gonna continue this underperforming trend that he had last year? What do you think Skyy Moore, or what do you think Rashee Rice is gonna do next season? Do you think that this soft prediction is anywhere close, or do you think it's way off? Let me know in the comments. With that, this is Gary signing out. Go Chiefs. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks for watching this video from the team at RGR Football. Click these videos to see more and subscribe to RGR Football.